Our speaker today is Jeffery Kopstein, but before I formally introduce him, I want to acknowledge that Professor Kopstein is delivering the Sylvia Zucker Memorial Lecture. And Sylvia Zucker was born in Brooklyn on July 13, 1912. She was the child of immigrants from Berlin and Bialystok. Bialystok is now part of Poland, but it was then part of the Russian Empire. Zucker graduated from Brooklyn College and was later a member of its faculty. In 1936, Zucker married Max Zucker, who was born in Poland and raised in Vienna. He immigrated to the United States at the age of 8. They had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Alice. Now, after Sylvia Zucker moved to Santa Rosa in 1982, she became an active member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and the Genocide, and she took part in annual community-wide Yom HaShoah commemorations. Zucker encouraged local Holocaust survivors to tell their stories in local middle and high schools, a tradition that the Alliance has continued to this day. Over the years, thousands of students in Sonoma County have learned of the Holocaust through the programs that Zucker originated. In a 2003 interview, Zucker said, "You know, life is full of little quirks and twists. You may get thrown for a little while, but then you've got to straighten up and brush yourself off." Sylvia Zucker died in 2017, just a few days before her 104th birthday. I don't know if any of Zucker's family members are joining us today on the live stream, but if so, words alone cannot express how deeply grateful we are at Sonoma State for the gift that underwrites today's lecture. She will continue to inspire young people for many decades to come. So I'm now very pleased to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Jeffery Kopstein, who is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California at Irvine. Professor Kopstein has very deep roots in the Bay Area. All of his post-secondary degrees were awarded by the University of California at Berkeley. Before arriving at UC Irvine in 2014, Professor Kopstein was on faculty at the University of Colorado Boulder and at the University of Toronto. Kopstein has authored, co-authored, or edited numerous books and dozens of scholarly articles. His expertise ranges from the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, comparative politics, present-day illiberalism, and of course, the Holocaust and genocide. The material for Professor Kopstein's talk today comes from a book he co-wrote with Yelena Subotic and Susan Welch called Politics, Violence, Memory, the New Social Science of the Holocaust. It was published last year by Cornell. So I'm very honored that Professor Kopstein is joining us today.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Can everybody hear me? Good. Great honor and privilege to be invited to give the Sylvia Zucker Memorial Lecture. Those of you who aren't professors know that it's going to sound strange. The highest honor you can get to be asked to come somewhere and to talk about your research. And really this research, as I was saying to Stephen before I started, that this research on the Holocaust, which I've spent the last decade, 15 years working on, it was the first bit of scholarship that I was actually working on what I said I was working on. Because I was actually studying the Holocaust for 20 years before that without actually saying I was studying the Holocaust. And all my books about East Germany and Russia and post-communism, I was really studying the Holocaust without actually doing it. And then when I turned to the subject that has so influenced my family's life, I felt for the first time that I was applying the techniques and methods that I knew, social science, in order to grapple with the Holocaust. And that's where the point of departure is tonight. So much of modern social science has really been about the Holocaust, even when it's not labeled as such. Just to give you some idea, social scientists did not work on the Holocaust until very late in the day. Political science, the first panel in the history of the American Political Science Association on the Holocaust, that's 10,000 political scientists who gather every year on Labor Day weekend, was in 2011. I know because I organized it. It wasn't that there weren't books before by political scientists, but they were so isolated that they were never thematized. So the one that Stephen, you will for sure know, is Danny Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners. He's a political scientist. Who you might not know is Raoul Hilberg's Destruction of the European Jews. He was a political scientist too, but he could never get a job. 3-volume study, the destruction of the European Jews. He couldn't get a job in political science for many years. He was told he would never get a job. This is weird because the Holocaust provides us with the kind of the categories that we think about social reality with. So many of them. Just to give you some idea. Right? Did you know the Milgram experiment? Who here has heard of the Milgram experiment? Right? That was all about the Holocaust. It was written right after the Eichmann trial. Right? It was the experiment was designed and implemented and then written after the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. The idea of human rights, our immigration regime, the word genocide itself. The word genocide itself, of course, is coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Jew from Lemberg, Lviv, today's Ukraine. Why is there no social science of the Holocaust? Right? So I'm going to talk about the Holocaust, I promise you, but I want to talk about the way we study the Holocaust. It's not that there hasn't been a lot written on the subject. There's been an awful lot written on the subject. It's mostly been written by historians, or there's been novels written about it. I mean, when the world's most record-obsessed people decided to kill the world's most literate people, there was going to be a lot of writing on the subject. It's sick, but it's true. But why no social science of the Holocaust? Well, for one thing, if you wanted to make it big within the discipline in my lifetime, you had to talk about big things. Debates of dictatorships and democracies. Why are some countries dictatorships? Why are some countries democracies? Who's going to win the president of the United States? I always tell my students, I always know exactly who's going to win the president of the United States. I know exactly the person who wins the Electoral College. But seriously, the Holocaust itself was considered too narrow, too Jewish. You would torpedo your career by studying. When I turned from studying post-communism back in the early 2000s to studying the Holocaust, people said, Kopstein, why are you torpedoing your own career? Why are you going to something so narrow as Jewish studies? This is a bit crazy. I said, but this is such an important subject. Why should only historians study it? The social sciences themselves have always been focused on the present. Relevant knowledge. Relevant knowledge. How can the Holocaust be seen not just as history, but relevant right now? Now, it is true that most students who studied it as a genocide. Indeed, it was the inspiration for the coining of the word. But how could you say something in general about genocide? Thank goodness there are actually very few. How many genocides have there been? 3, 5, 7, depends how you count it, depends how you define it. But thankfully, actually very few. And so, as we say in the social sciences, if n equals 7, how are you going to make generalizations about that as a phenomenon? The conditions under which it occurs, why it occurs, who makes it happen, the nature of victimhood. Some historians were inspired by social science. So you have Browning. Christopher Browning wrote this book called Police Battalion 101, ordinary German battalion from Hamburg, made up from a cross-section of German society. They were sent out to occupied Poland, and they were told, go kill these people now. They weren't necessarily very Nazi. They weren't necessarily even anti-Semitic. They go out there, they not only do it, but they appear to do it with great glee. And so he tries to figure out why, and he uses Milgram. He says, well, it's because it was small group behavior. It was obedience to authority. So people did talk about this. They did use it, but the social scientists themselves largely didn't. What changed? What changed so that political scientists, sociologists, economists would start working on the Holocaust? Well, a couple of things happened. First, the Berlin Wall fell. And this led to an opening of the archives all throughout Eastern Europe. And so people like me could start to use, I grew up with Russian. People like me could start to use the archive there in order to construct very detailed data sets. We could generate gigantic amounts of data about what happened in very small places. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This allowed for scholars not only to use archives, but to talk to people on the ground. So people like Father Desbois started talking to peasants on the ground in Ukraine, in Poland, in Belarus, in order to document what he called the Holocaust by bullets. That is, in the eastern part of Europe, the vast majority of victims never saw a concentration camp. The violence was up close, personal, intimate, if you will. The genocide there looked a lot more like the genocide in Rwanda, the genocide in Yugoslavia, the genocide in Cambodia, than it did the impersonal, industrialized world of the concentration camp. And so our view of the Holocaust started to change. Not that the Holocaust wasn't unique, of course it's unique. But what made it unique was not necessarily the impersonality of the Eichmann, of the what the Germans called the Schreibtischtäter, the desk murderer, from 40,000 feet, if you will. But what also made it unique was that part of it was carried out by people on the spot near where the victims lived. Shooting pits, pogroms. And so you started to have these big methodological changes. Since there were few genocides, this led to a rethinking of the Holocaust as, instead of one big event, which takes place all over Europe, across multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple cultures, which makes it a very daunting thing to study, because nobody knows all those languages. It's not enough just to know German. Instead, the Holocaust consists of multiple events, and you can start to break it down. It consists, think about it for a second. It consists of residential segregation. That is the creation of ghettos. It consists of pogroms, of neighbor-on-neighbor violence. We've seen that before in history. It consists of local-level massacres. We've seen that too. It consists of taking people on trains and sending them very far away from where they lived. That's what happens under the Armenian genocide. And then, of course, the world of the concentration camp. In short, you have these multiple phenomena, each of which can be studied separately and compared. And so, in effect, the Holocaust is not one event, but many, many, many thousands of events, each of which can be studied, each of which can be coded, each of which can then be generalized about in comparison to other similar kinds of events. This was revolutionary. It invited a whole new generation of people working on the Holocaust, of which I'm just one. A whole new generation of social scientists started working on the Holocaust again for a very long time. And it's led to a kind of an outpouring of research. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the research. And I think it's sort of from the standpoint of understanding, I understand the Holocaust, of course, it's a tragedy of biblical proportions. It takes 1 out of every 3 Jews in the world. Just to think of the tragedy of the Holocaust, the proportions here, we're just now, this year, coming up to the level of Jewish population in the world, 15.6 million, that existed before the Holocaust. And to give you an idea of how big of a tragedy it is, how many Jews would there be today had there been no Holocaust? We have answers. Demographer study. Sergio Della Pergola, Israel's leading demographer, has 3 articles on the subject. And the estimate is between 25 and 35 million Jews there would be in today's world. Just to give you some idea of the level of tragedy. So how has new research changed how we view things? Well, let me tell you about some research I did with Jason Wittenberg at Berkeley. The Pogroms of summer of 1941. This really started with a book by a historian, by Jan Gross, who actually is a sociologist. He left sociology into history. He wrote a book about a small town in Poland called Jedwabne, northeastern Poland. On July 7th, 1941, the Germans invade, they come through, and they say to the locals, do what you want. In fact, they try to get the locals to kill their Jewish neighbors. And in fact, the local Poles do that. Half the town kills the other half the town. They torment the Jews, they chase them, they humiliate them, and the ones who are left, they put into a barn, they burn them to death on July 7th, 1941. It turns out that in the weeks after June 22nd, 1941, as the Germans invade the Eastern Front, as they open the Eastern Front and invade the Soviet Union, invade Eastern Poland, in hundreds of towns and communities, the locals turn violently against their Jewish neighbors. Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Romanians, some Belarusians. This was a brief spurt. It lasts for about 6 weeks. The Germans then come back and ghettoize everybody and basically kill almost everybody. But in this 6-week period, this over an exceptionally broad territory, by our count, in 219 locations, the local Poles and Ukrainians in the areas that we have good data on, in 219 out of 2,000 places, so about 10% of places, the locals massacre their Jewish neighbors. How do we know that? We know it really from 2 sources. Well, 3 sources. One is after the war, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw took testimony from survivors right after the war. And this is the best sources we have. Why are they so good? Because nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew what to think. The word Holocaust wasn't used yet. Nobody had seen Schindler's List. You understand? They just said what happened. And the word pogrom came up over and over again. And essentially what happened is I read all of these. For this project, I read all of these testimonies. Most of them are in Polish, some of them are in Yiddish, some are in Russian, some in English, German, French. People gave it in whatever language they could. The second source is right after the war, the KGB, what was at that time called the NKVD, organized these things called extraordinary commissions. And they, as the Soviet army reinvades the territory that had been occupied by the Germans, they interview, interrogate, torture the locals, and say what happened. And you can get those reports of these extraordinary commissions, they were called, are available at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. You can get them all. So you can download them onto your computer. You got to read the languages. Those are the two biggies, but there's a third, and that is the SS. The Germans themselves sent reports back home. They wanted the locals to do this. But they were frustrated that in most places they couldn't get the locals to do this. It's not that the locals liked Jews. Most times they didn't. But to get them to actually carry out these massacres is a different story. So we have multiple different kinds of sources. Sometimes the Jewish Historical Testimonies Institute testimonies are repeated again in Yad Vashem at their research institute in Israel. And it's very interesting to see the small differences between the testimonies given under Polish communist circumstances versus in kind of 1960s Israel. The story is basically the same, but there are some small differences. Okay. The question Jason and I asked is why some communities became toxic. Why did pogroms occur in some places and not in others? Not in most places. Why did some communities in particular become toxic under the right circumstances? The Germans roll through, they go through very quickly, and they say, do what you want. And only in some places do they become toxic. We have pictures of them. I'm not going to show you all the pictures. There are many pictures. This is Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg on June 30th, 1941. There's all kinds of violence. You can see it's local against neighbor on neighbor violence. These are, if you've ever been to Lemberg or Lviv, it's a beautiful city. It's a upper middle class city. These are not peasants killing each other. There was sexual violence involved. There was lots of looting involved. You can, if you put on YouTube Lvov pogrom, you'll see film. Right? The Germans filmed some of it. Some of this is also taken by Ukrainians. These are Ukrainians, sometimes Poles, killing their Jewish neighbors. Kaunas. This is the famous garage massacre on June 27th, where a Ukrainian nationalist kills 51 Jews with a pipe wrench at a garage. Before there are, you can see in the background, people are, not from this angle, there are multiple pictures of this taken by a German army photographer of people putting kids on their shoulders to watch this. And afterwards, the guy who beats up the Jews plays an accordion, plays the national anthem on the accordion. So this was like a festival-like violence. It was sort of like lynching in the American South, a festival of violence of sorts. Some observations. Okay, so the study that Jason Wittenberg and I undertook had about 2,000 communities, and we found that pogroms occurred in about 10%, where they could have, that is where Jews lived. Why did these pogroms, why did they occur? So what we did is we did basic social science. We said, what was special about these communities? We collected we looked at census data, we looked at socioeconomic data. Were they rich or were they poor? Were they more literate, less literate? We looked at elections for political scientists, right? There happened to be in this area of Poland pretty free and fair elections into the late 1920s, early 1930s. We knew how they voted. And we know that sometimes political polarization can make people upset. There's nothing else we've learned in the United States. We've learned that over the last 7 years. How much anti-Semitism was it? There were anti-Semitic parties. We measured that as well. Was it communism? This entire area had been occupied by the Soviet Union between 1939 and 1941. And they had arrested Poles and Ukrainians and sometimes Jews and thrown them into prison and sometimes deported them to Siberia or to Central Asia. The strange thing about this, by the way, is those people who were Jews who were deported to Siberia or Central Asia, they survived. The ones who were punished survived. Those who stayed mostly died. So what did we look at? We thought that the hypothesis that we went in there with was saying, we said those areas where the anti-Semitic parties did really well, that were most anti-Semitic, that's where we expected the pogroms to occur. Not true. The fact that, and it'll surprise you, it actually won't surprise you when I tell you this. Actually, the older Jewish people, it won't surprise them. For the students, it might. The problem from that point of view, anti-Semitism was strong everywhere. It can't distinguish between pogrom and non-pogrom locales. Lots of places had lots of anti-Semitism and did not have a pogrom. Was it that the Jews were richer in those places? They had more stuff to steal, their apartments, the clothing, the silverware, the paintings. I remember that picture of Lavon. It was a beautiful apartment building where that pogrom happened. The answer is no. Only in part. It can't really explain why pogroms happened in some places and not in others. Was it communism? In those places where the communists were stronger, is that where you'd have pogroms? After all, we know that a lot of Jews were communists. Why? Because communism promised a world in which solidarities would no longer be based on ethnicity or race. Workers of the world unite. So we expected that maybe because Jews were more heavily communist than non-Jews, that's where the pogroms would occur. In fact, when we looked at it, the Jews weren't very communist at all. That's number one. And number two, in those areas where communism was most powerful, there were fewer pogroms. Why? Because the locals were less racist. Locals, communism was not a beautiful ideology. It had beautiful promises, but it was authoritarian, very clearly authoritarian, but it was not racist. That's the one thing it wasn't. It wasn't racist. And so in those areas where communism was strong, you had fewer pogroms. So was it the Germans? After all, no Germans, no pogroms. Problem is that if that were true, you would have had far more. The Germans were everywhere. You would have had many more pogroms. You only had 10% places with pogroms. So it can't be just the Germans. The Germans might have been necessary, but it could not have been a sufficient condition. No way. I'm not letting the Germans off the hook, but that alone can't explain it. Soviet presence, again, the Soviets were everywhere. You had lots of places that had Soviet KGB prisons, NKVD prisons, that were stuffed full of corpses when the Soviets left. They killed nationalists. We also had no pogroms in some of those places. Places where people should have been the most angry. No pogroms. So what did we find? What we found, here's the weird thing. We found in those places where the pre-existing vote for 1941 was most polarized, that is where the Jews and the locals were voting for totally separate political parties. We had voting data down to the village level. Yeah. If anybody wants to use it, it's yours. Where the locals voted for their nationalists, whether Ukrainian or Polish, and the Jews voted for their nationalists, that's where you had pogroms. Why? What do I mean, first of all? Who were the Jews voting for? What did it mean to be a Jewish nationalist? Now we get on to some interesting stuff. This is the 1920s and 30s. Remember, there had been no Holocaust yet. There was no state of Israel. It didn't exist. It wouldn't exist till 1948. But the Jews were still nevertheless mobilized into their own politics. And not many people pay attention to pre-war Jewish politics. Largest party in pre-World War II Poland, the largest Jewish party. You may not have heard of him. You've heard of this guy. The most popular Jewish politician in the world before 1941 was a guy named Yitzhak Grunbaum in Yiddish. He was a member of the Polish parliament, the Sejm. He was the head of the Polish Zionists, head of the Polish, what was called the General Zionists. Grunbaum is a fascinating character. He wanted to mobilize, what did it mean to be a Zionist in pre-World War II Poland? Did it mean, what does Zionism mean? That's a whole different question, which I should ask students, which is a great question. What it really meant, first of all, it did not even mean, it meant you dreamed of going to Israel. It didn't yet exist. You dreamed of a Jewish state in the Middle East. And it didn't yet exist. So what did it mean? It meant you were going to pursue Jewish communal national interests within Poland or Ukraine or Lithuania or Germany or Hungary. What did that mean, communal interests? What were Jewish communal interests? Jewish communal interests, of course, most of you will guess, will be synagogues, of course, the easiest one. But how about this in interwar Poland? Did you know in interwar Poland, it won't surprise you to know, Sunday was a day of rest. You could not operate a business on a Sunday. Well, what did that mean for Jews? This was bad. Because Jews don't work when? Saturday. That meant Jews had to take 2 days off by law. This was a discriminatory law for Jews. Jews were promised, according to the Versailles Treaty, education in their own languages, Yiddish and increasingly Hebrew. Poles never followed through on that promise, ever. Jews wanted to be in the Polish cabinet. 10% of the Polish population was Jewish. 30% of the population of Poland wasn't Polish. Not one Jew, not one German, not one Ukrainian, not one Belarusian I'll stay here, was ever, I wander too much, was ever in any Polish cabinet in the pre-World War II era. Never included in government. They got elected. But they were discriminated against, and they weren't happy, and somebody like Grunbaum was loud. He was loud, he was aggressive, he was full-chested Zionist. Full-chested Jewish, proud to be Jewish. And the Poles didn't like him. Grunbaum's an interesting character, by the way. He leaves Poland. He gets out. He leaves in 1935. He makes it to Palestine, pre-state, the Yishuv, pre-state Palestine. He becomes a member of parliament in the Knesset after 1948. He becomes Israel's first minister of the interior. He's one who did make it. His son does not make it out. His son is arrested by the Nazis, put in a concentration camp, works as a capo, survives the war, goes to Paris after World War II, comes to Israel, and dies in the War of Independence in 1948. Fascinating character. Not many people have written about this guy. But what it meant to be a Zionist is you were not going to join the nation-building project. I have no criticism of Zionism here. None. Zero. The Jews had just as much a right to their nation-building project as any other group. I'm not making a statement about present-day Israel at all. I am saying the Jews had just as much a right to their nation-building project as any other group, and when they voted Zionist in interwar Poland, that was telling the local population, whatever we are going to be, we are not joining your nation-building project. We are our own nation. And under the right circumstances, that lack of solidarity between the two groups, when all the arrows were pointing in one direction, the Germans said, do whatever you want, in those communities where the Jews were mobilized into their local politics, into their local Zionist politics, they were massacred. If they voted for Polish parties, they were left alone. The Germans came and killed them later. Now, what's interesting about this explanation, when we came up with this explanation, this is the core of a book that we wrote called Intimate Violence. As my father says, tell them, my father's 90, he says, tell them not to read the book, tell them to buy the book. So the important thing here, is this explanation that we're offering, it's all not all that, you know where we got that explanation from? The study of lynching in the American South. In those communities where local whites and blacks were mobilized in the Republican politics, you were most likely in the pre-Jim Crow era, between Reconstruction and World War I. You were most likely to get a lynching in those kinds of communities. So seen this way, actually this literature from lynching actually helps us understand an episode in the Holocaust. It's all about local politics. I'm not saying this explains everything, it doesn't. But it explains things that we didn't see before. We now see that in a different light. The Holocaust took place in places. How are we doing on time? You okay? Yeah. 10 more minutes, easy. I'm going to give you one more example of social science research, which is also really interesting. So the bottom line in the research that I did with Jason Wittenberg was that pogroms happened where Jews were considered to be political rivals. Not the Holocaust as a whole, but it's one very brutal episode of breakdown in trust between ethnic communities, which I think is portable. Think about our society. The conditions under which, Charlottesville. What if Charlottesville had not been, in January 2017, a liberal college town? Would have been racially divided along political lines where the police didn't care at all. I'm not here to tell you anything differently would have happened, but I think it could have been a lot worse, as bad as it was. Okay. Let me tell you about another little bit of social science. My colleagues, Volha Charnish, she's at MIT, and Yevgeny Finkel, he's at Johns Hopkins. They wrote an article called Death Camp El Dorado. I'm going to tell you about this. The red dot in the center there is the death camp, Treblinka. Treblinka was not a work camp. It was set up for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to take Jews, send them there, and kill them. It operated for only a specific period of time, and then it was demolished, deconstructed. And it was put where it was because it is, I'm not going to step away from the podium. You'll notice Białystok, that was brought up during the introduction, in the north, northeast, and Warsaw. And it's put there on a train spur. It's put there for no reason at all, except it's halfway. That's very important. That's an important fact, what I'm about to tell you. So what's the next slide? Okay, so nearly 1 million Jews were murdered in Treblinka. It's set up in 1942 as part of what was called Operation Reinhardt. And what Charnish and Finkel look at is the long-term political and economic behavior in the area surrounding Treblinka. This is going to sound weird, I know. Just stay with me for a minute. We know that the belongings and property of the murdered Jews ended up in local hands. Barkeepers, prostitutes, the guards of the camps, and the locals who ran the camps took these goods and ended up trading. They discovered that the locals benefited economically from the death of the Jews, even decades after the war. So what they did, and I'm going to go back here. They looked at essentially concentric circles around Treblinka. And what they found, stay with me here for a minute, because it's a very strange fact. They looked at what would peasants put their money into? Remember, this is a rural area. There's nothing around here. What would they put their money? Remember, this place becomes communist. You can't like buy cars and television sets and stuff like that. Nor could you really keep cash or diamonds, or you could keep diamonds or gold or clothing, or furs, the stuff that they were stealing from Jews who were deported to this camp and murdered. What they hypothesized is people put it into real estate. In particular, they had data on the roofs of the houses. This is what census collects. The roofs of the houses. What kind of roofs did people have on their houses? If you didn't have money, you had a thatched roof. You had wood. If you had money, you had a metal roof. We know that today. If you look around the United States, metal roofs are really in vogue. They last a lot longer than shingle roofs. Shingles are between thatch and metal. What they found is the closer you got to the camp, the more metal roofs you had. That is to say, that's 1970 they found this in. The Holocaust ends in 40, well, the Treblinka's finished as a place by 43. Between 1943 and 1970, you continued to have richer people the closer you got to the camp decades later. Decades. I don't know about you. I was completely blown away by this result. Now you'd say, okay, maybe it's because they already were richer, these peasants closer to the camp. They had money already, right? And so, but they're not explaining anything. That's where this placement of the camp is very important. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. The people weren't already richer beforehand. There's no evidence at all that there was a pre-existing disparity of wealth as you move away from Treblinka before 1945. It's not there. There's no evidence for that. So that's number one. Number two, they also found that proximity to Treblinka influences contemporary voting behavior. That is, you're much more likely to vote for radically anti-Semitic parties the closer you are to that camp. Why? They hypothesized two reasons. One is everybody knows there was this huge transfer of wealth between the Jewish victims and the locals, and people feel rotten about it. But even more so, they're worried that the Jews will want restitution. There will be a call for communal restitution. Those local Poles who got rich, if you were, now it's sort of ridiculous, of course, like how rich did they really get having metal roofs versus thatched roofs? But that there would be a call for a one-time retransfer of wealth back to Jews, back to the Jewish victims, if not individually, then at least collectively. And these anti-Semitic parties in contemporary Poland run on no restitution to Jews platform. That's part of their political platform. So you have this result. Last but not least, Robert Brown, he's at Berkeley, he's a sociologist. He did fascinating work on the Netherlands. What he did, he wanted to know why some communities protected their Jews in the Netherlands and some didn't. And he did some major heavy lifting here. He found records for 93% of Jews where they lived before World War II. And he geocoded them to their addresses where they lived. And what he found, what he looked for is which churches were closest by where they lived. And what he found, here's the interesting thing, Jews were much more likely to receive assistance from Catholic churches in predominantly Protestant areas, and more likely to receive assistance from Protestant churches in predominantly Catholic areas. That is to say, from other minority religious institutions. And this is an important finding because what it shows you is that the propensity to help Jews was not based on Catholic or Protestant theology at all. It was based on minority status, fellow minorities backing each other up. Now, this is important because, of course, the Dutch Jewish community was almost completely wiped out. Not a large community, but it was wiped out very completely. And so here you have, there's been a lot written on the roles of churches. And what he's found is something different. It's not really what the priests or reverends or ministers were saying in their weekly homilies. It was really the place of other minorities in the society, what we would call, what the American politics people today would call shared fate. Shared fate, the notion of shared fate of different minorities. We know this is true from other parts of Europe. We know, for example, Ukrainians in Polish areas, even though in Ukrainian areas they killed Jews with great abandon, Ukrainians in Polish areas were much more likely to help Jews. We know that Czech Baptists in Ukrainian areas were much more likely to help Jews. So this phenomenon of minority populations helping out other minorities, it also works for the Holocaust itself. So these are three examples of how social science research, which requires a gigantic amount of heavy lifting. Imagine what Robert Brown did here. He geocoded every single Jew where they live, the street, the address, before World War II. This is a giant research project. The one that I did, I had to collect voting data on every single village in Eastern Poland. But of course, the computing technology has made it much now. I mean, before you would have everything on key punch cards. It was crazy, right? Now you have all these statistical programs. Once you have it punched in, you can manipulate the data in all kinds of ways. I mean, manipulate in a good sense in order to test for rival hypotheses and to make the Holocaust speak back to the mainstream of social science. Because as unique as the Holocaust is, and it is unique, think about it, the Jews they hunted down Jews from all over the world. The Nazis had lists of American Jewish communities. Lists. That's sort of unique. But not every aspect of it is incomparable. And I'm all for comparing the Holocaust. I think it has to be compared. I think if we don't compare it in the way that I'm doing it here, it will become increasingly irrelevant to the younger generation. It has to be made relevant. And I think this is one way of doing it. And I think it's an important way of doing it. And I hope you kind of share my scholarly passion and enthusiasm for it. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have. So thank you very much.
So, as always, students have the right to ask the first questions, and
what shocked you most in your research?
Incident. What shocked me most? There was one incident. It's place in a town called Szczucin. Lots of S's and Z's. Szczucin, in eastern Poland. June 27th, 1941. The Germans come through, and I know this because there's a letter written by a survivor named Chaya Soika Golding. He wrote the letter right after the war in Amsterdam. There's a little Szczucin museum now in Houston. And she writes in this letter, the Germans rolled in quickly. They moved on because they're trying to get east. They want to go, it's called Blitzkrieg. The idea is they want to get to Moscow as fast as they can. They leave a small field troop. And they tell the locals, do whatever you want to do. Field troop is outside of the city. The locals, she writes, break up into three groups. Local Poles, a few Lithuanians, but mostly Poles. Principal of the school, post office inspector, lawyer, leading groups of people massacring Jews. utterly massacring, right? With graphic descriptions that, beggar the imagination. That evening, they run to the priest for help. And he says, I can't help you. Sorry, you're a bunch of communists. I'm not going to do anything for you. They run to what they call the local intelligentsia, which usually means veterinarians. It's a rural community. Veterinarians, lawyers, no mercy, nothing. That night, somebody comes to them and says, this is going to happen for the next 2 days. The men leave as fast as they can. The women are panicked, utterly panicked. Soika Golding they decide to get an idea, they're going to go speak to the Germans. Small field troop sitting outside. They go speak to the Germans. They say, look, you're Germans. This is a lack of order. This is bad. We didn't deserve this. And the Germans say, it's not our affair. We're just military people. It's not our affair. Whatever's happening in your town is happening. And then she says, and then we gave them soap and coffee. We offered them soap and coffee. And with that, the pogrom came to an end. Okay. I read this many, many times, as you can imagine, this testimony. And there's a few other small testimonies of that place along these lines. Of course, it's the 5th day of the war. The war starts on June 22nd. This is June 27th. The Germans had soap and coffee. Only 5 days into the war. Clearly, soap and coffee did not mean soap and coffee. And there's a second letter that I discovered, which says, at that point, stop the war, and the most beautiful daughters of the Jewish community went to work for the Germans. I'm describing you 3 years of thinking, right? Of kind of it dawning on me what had actually occurred. Now, I knew about rape, of course, but I didn't know that sexual slavery was attached to this. That shocked me, and it was the slow burn that shocked me. And of course, the Germans complaining that they couldn't get the locals to do this. That happened in Belarusian areas a lot. The Belarusians were not as violently anti-Semitic as the others. Although, as I said, this does not occur everywhere. It does not occur in most places. This is really extreme stuff.
Is there any research into the surrounding areas of other camps of the phenomenon of the wealth of locals?
It's a great question. Why not replicate this? The reason this is such a powerful research design from a design standpoint is precisely because there's nothing else around it. So it's placed there almost like somebody, closes their eyes and puts it in. And that's important because what it tells you is they didn't put it there for a pre-existing reason, except for its halfwayness. And all the other camps are placed in proximity to industrial towns or close to this or close to that, which keeps you from, which in essence, would this kind of result that they found, it would contaminate that result. They say, oh, yeah, those peasants were already richer to begin with. They didn't steal it. But this is the evidence for the theft here, and the long-term impact of the theft is especially powerful because precisely because of its random, not in the sense that you guys use the word random. I'm talking about unsystematic. I know your generation uses random to mean strange. It's not strange. This is unsystematic. They put it there for completely arbitrary reasons. And that makes the design very powerful. What it tells you under these kinds of conditions, this alerts us to property transfer, which is part of genocide. I mean, think about the American West. Right? It's part of genocide. This nails it down, if you will, with tremendous precision. The closer you are to that camp, every 5 kilometers yields you 2% higher vote for the anti-Semitic party. Now you may say 2%, so what? I'm old enough to remember 2020 when 2% was a lot of votes. Votes. 2% matters in an election. It does. I'm just using examples that you know, right? Okay. More questions?
Can I ask one? Does your political polarization model work for the pre-occupation pogrom that Jeff Weidlinger has recently written about?
Yeah.
And then second, I wonder if you could hypothesize a little bit about the link between non-Jewish nation building products and anti-Semitism. You could take the case of Belarus, which seemed to have a very low sense of national distinctiveness, but also hardly any anti-Semitism.
Hardly any, yes. So that's great questions. So these were not the first pogroms that I talked. These are not the first pogroms that happened. Right? There've been the word pogrom itself comes from the Russian
Little storm.
gromit, to smash, break, grom. Right? And exactly, a little storm. And it's used as a word starting really in the 1870s, even a little bit earlier, the earliest usages of it. There were three big rounds of pogroms historically in Russia. 1881 to 84, 1903 to 1906, that's where the Kishinev pogrom occurs. And then 1918 to 1920, just at the tail end of World War I. Jeff Weidlinger wrote a book about those pogroms. What I'll say about it is the following. The thing about democratic politics, which makes my explanation is really good for democratic politics. What makes it unique, democratic politics, is it translates, again, we know this from the United States, ethnic demography into political behavior extremely efficiently by way of the ballot box. The pogroms that he's talked about are, of course, pre-democratic. It's not to say that the mobilization of Jews into the public sphere did not influence those pogroms. They do. They do. That's part of what the pogroms are about, is what to do about the Jews. The advent of pogroms has to do with the Jewish question. And the Jewish question, historically, is can Jews also be citizens as Jews? The French answer historically to that was, yes, they can be citizens, but not as Jews. As long as in the public sphere, they are not different from anybody else, they can be citizens. Of course, and because that seemed to prove that even that was not viable. Yes, it's very important. It's the failure of the French model that leads you to Zionism. It leads you that we can't be citizens even here, even in France, much less Germany, much less Russia. In other places where the kind of good French model was never put in, that is Germany, not until very late, not until the end of World War I, and in Russia, really never. The Jewish question, or Hungary, or Romania, the Jewish question that is the entry of Jews into the citizenry, as not differentiated with any differences in civil rights status, that all those places have pogroms, and in every case, it's about that. What makes the pogroms that I'm looking at, that I looked at with Jason, so different is that once you have democratic politics, people can identify with great precision, those areas where the Jews are a political threat to the ownership of the state. To the ownership, because that was the Jewish threat. The Jewish threat is Poland going to be Polish? Only for the Poles. Is Ukraine going to be Ukrainian? Only for the Ukrainians. And in a pre-democratic era, you couldn't measure that all that well. But in a democratic area, when all of a sudden you had these Zionists and Bundists, and I haven't talked about the Bund, right, which is another form of Jewish nationalist politics based on Yiddish as opposed to Hebrew. And actually, the Bundists and the Zionists, people my grandparents' generation made a big deal about the difference between those two things. They weren't all that different. They weren't. Actually, my grandfather was a Bundist and then became a Zionist. It's basically just two different forms of Jewish nationalism. And so that puts the question, and that's why the era of lynching in the United States is tied up with Reconstruction and Black citizenship. Because it's then when African Americans become a threat to the white power structure. Without the vote, there's no threat. Does that make some sense? And your last question was about what about the non-Jewish nationalisms? The non-Jewish nationalisms were everywhere. The Ukrainians, the Poles in the area that I care about here, the Poles first. Not all Poles were anti-Semites, but some were really anti-Semitic. The Ukrainians second. Ukrainian anti-Semitism was actually a smaller phenomenon, but in order to get help, you know who the Ukrainians turned to? The Germans. And the Germans told the Ukrainian Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was formed in Vienna in 1929, but then was trained by the Abwehr, by German military intelligence in the run-up to World War II. They told the Ukrainians, you're going to get your own state. We're going to give you your own state. Out of the Soviet Union, you just got to do this one little thing for us first. And they carried out the German orders. Right? But it was not that large of a group. It was the joining in of the Ukrainian population that I'm really much more interested in, as opposed to this small group of Ukrainian exiles who were kind of fed, watered, and trained by the Germans. Okay, does that basically answer your question? Yeah.
I suppose my question is a comparison question based off of it. You mentioned a lot how the Belarusians didn't participate as much in these pogroms. Comparatively, the Lithuanians did much more. Do you feel that might have had something to do with later German crackdowns on the area, where Lithuania suffered much less compared to Belarus?
Yeah, it's very good. The Lithuanian story is a lot like the Ukrainian story. That is dissatisfaction with Soviet occupation, and then the training by the German military. Here's the thing. I haven't done research in Lithuania. I don't speak Lithuanian. I found there's a big debate on how many Lithuanian anti-Jewish pogroms there were. We know the Garage Massacre, right? We know of a few others. The Lithuanian sources and the Yiddish language sources differ a great deal. I couldn't do exactly the same kind of research. What we do know is that the Belarusian sense of national identity, as Stephen just said, comes very late in the day. It comes very late in the day. And in fact, in the Polish census of 1931, which has this huge Belarusian area in the eastern part of Poland, they made up a category. Because censuses are always political. We know that, right? And so they had a category called, in Polish, tutejsi, which means you're here. You're from here. So we ask, what are you? Your answer is, I'm from here. Well, that means that you're not, you're not going to say you're built, but when asked what your religion was, they were Christians. So they were Christians from here. The Poles viewed them as ripe material for assimilation to Polish. Get rid of their Belarusian schools, get rid of their language. In a generation, you'll have Poles. For my purposes, the impact of that is the Belarusians were not as easily mobilized into anti-Jewish violence as their Ukrainian, Lithuanian, or Polish counterparts. I think that's the sort of answer to that.
Just a thought, New Testament, Herod organizes a tax system.
Sorry?
Herod, King
Oh,
Herod,
Herod, okay, yes,
registers all of Palestine.
yes.
And 10 years later, comes where he knows the Jews are living and tries to kill every first son.
Yes.
I'm just saying this is rather old.
It's old stuff. It's okay. I'm so happy. I have an article. I'm happy to send it to you. The first recorded pogrom. Well, first of all, the first anti-pogrom, the pogrom that almost happened but didn't, the reverse pogrom is of course the Book of Esther. Right? But let's move from the realm of myth into history. Right? Nothing against the Book of Esther, but it is what it is. History. The first recorded pogrom is in 38 CE in Alexandria, Egypt, recorded by Philo, the Jewish philosopher, recorded in 2 books. It occurs when Caligula comes to power in Rome, and the local Roman ruler in the area, a guy named Flaccus, loses his control over the local Greek population. There were 100,000 Jews living in Alexandria at the time. This is 38. Remember, the temple is still standing. The temple will not be destroyed till 70. It's amazing, period. This has been written about both by Josephus, later on, it tells us about Masada, and by Philo. Philo wrote a book called Flaccus, where he blames Flaccus for this anti-Jewish violence carried out by the Greek population who were worried the Jews would get citizenship. Now it's starting to sound familiar. Because remember, my thing is all about citizenship and threat. Now, of course, citizenship meant something different. They're not talking about voting, right? But citizenship pertained to taxation. We know that. I could talk about this for hours, but the Jews are basically, the women are forced to eat pork. The men are scourged. I know those of you who are Christian know what scourging is. It's a form of Roman torture. Like, your skin is scraped and they pour stuff over your skin. That is punishments that Jews shouldn't have to face because they're semi-citizens. This was a battle over citizenship. Afterwards, Caligula dies. And first, just Philo heads off to Rome to have an audience with Caligula. So there is a second book called Embassy to Rome by Philo, where he describes this. And he describes chasing around a character who gives everybody, Caligula, who has no attention span and gives everybody nicknames. I almost wrote the op-ed on that. Gives everybody nicknames and won't listen to him and makes fun of him. Why don't you people eat pork? Why won't you put my statue in your synagogues? I'm better than your God. But no one has such a good God. I mean, I could do the imitation.
Not anti-Semitic because my son-in-law is Jewish.
I didn't go there. He basically leaves, and then Caligula dies, and a new ruler comes to power, Claudius, and Claudius writes a letter to the local Greeks and the local Jews saying, look, you Greeks, stop hammering on the Jews. The Jews have every right to be there. I understand they're not going to pray to me, but they pray for me. That's what Jews still do in synagogue, right? A prayer for the government. You don't pray to the government, you pray for the government. But you Jews, he then goes on and says, don't ask for more than you are entitled to in a city, and here's the great quote, which is not your own. It's about citizenship. It's about citizenship. And so I have this article where I talk about anti-Jewish violence from antiquity to the present as basically the same story repeating itself. And I want to write a book on it. And I got a whole fellowship to go to the Holocaust Museum for a year to write a book on it. I wrote more articles on it. And I keep on going to presses, and everybody says, nobody's going to be interested in this. Nobody wants to hear about Caligula and all that stuff. But I think it's absolutely fascinating that in essence, this political aspect of anti-Jewish violence, which has been ignored because everybody just says it's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in ancient Greece? Come on. I mean, it's a long time ago. This is pre-Christian. There were no Christians. No one knew who Jesus was. No one would know who Jesus was for a couple hundred years. So, you know, I think I'm onto something. Obviously, I'm passionate about it, but I got two of the same. I have this at UCI. It's the two of the front row commandos, two of the same people asking questions. I'm happy. I mean, how many? Did I take more questions?
Yeah, so we have just a few minutes left, so keep your questions.
Okay, well, why don't I get him? Because he hasn't get to ask a question. He had his hand up politely.
Looking at your research, I thought I would ask you, growing up in the post-war period, it's very troubling at times how remembrance has been either ignored or improperly approached. And I would like to know if during the time you've researched the Shoah, are there steps that could have been taken to make remembrance more meaningful and present in the post-war period?
Yeah, but there could have been, but it wasn't. I think there are reasons why. Okay, so the way the Holocaust was depicted and remembered and by historians, then it gets translated into memory, is the world of the camps. And when I was growing up, that's the way I grew up among Holocaust survivors in Toronto. Which is a city of 35,000 Holocaust survivors after World War II. It was a big survivor city. And the world of the camps. Now it's true, the camps were these death camps and many Jews, millions died in those camps, gassed, murdered in various ways. But that story, the story of the camps, is largely a West European story. It's largely a story of the Jews of Western Europe being put onto trains, France, Germany, to some extent Hungary in 1944, being sent by train. It's that image of the impersonal, industrialized murder. That's our image of the Holocaust, where there's not a lot of hate involved. The hate is really a high-level ideology as opposed to like common people. And I think that's a misremembering of the story. That's not how the story unfolded. The story in Eastern Europe is a story of shooting pits and pogroms and up close and personal. The Germans couldn't have carried it out on their own. No way. And so our story of the Holocaust is incomplete. It's a far more vicious, a story that's much more like Rwanda than it is like a plane bombing from 30,000 feet. And the story of collaboration, because anti-communism, anti-communist is the next guy, right? The anti-communists kept us from telling the story about local collaboration, which our grandparents sort of told us about, but we kind of ignored it in favor of this Arendtian story, and Arendt, of about the negative side of modernity. That's the story that was told before that. Modernity is great, except in this case, you had factories that produced corpses as opposed to goods. That was the story that we grew up with. That's not the story. The story is much more like this. The story is it happened in places. Each of these places have a backstory, and that backstory tells us much more about how the Holocaust happened than any reference to bureaucracy and modernity does.
Thank you.